The morning sun cast long shadows across the USS Enterprise's flight deck as Lieutenant Jessica Martinez adjusted her crisp uniform and checked her watch. Another VIP tour day, her least favorite duty assignment. Today's group included 35 family members of retired naval personnel, mostly elderly spouses taking one last nostalgic look at the kind of vessel where their husbands had served. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the USS Enterprise," Jessica announced with practiced enthusiasm. Over her 50-year career, this magnificent vessel has served as home to tens of thousands of sailors and aviators. Among the tour group, one woman immediately caught Jessica's attention, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. Margaret Williams, 82, moved with careful precision despite her age. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore simple, khaki pants with a faded navy windbreaker. Her dependent spouse ID card identified her as the widow of Admiral Robert Williams, but something about her bearing suggested more than just a grieving widow on a sentimental journey. Margaret carried a worn leather portfolio covered in faded patches that were too weathered to read clearly. When asked about her interest in visiting the Enterprise, she simply smiled and mentioned wanting to see how naval aviation had evolved since her husband's time. As the group moved through the ship's corridors, Margaret naturally gravitated toward the rear of the formation, but Jessica noticed something peculiar. The elderly woman navigated the narrow passageways and steep ladders with unconscious ease, automatically ducking at the right spots and stepping aside for passing crew members with timing that spoke of muscle memory rather than instruction. "First stop is the flight deck," Jessica announced as they climbed toward the morning light. "You'll witness actual flight operations and meet some of our incredible crew members." The flight deck stretched out before them like a massive steel city alive with the coordinated chaos of FA-18 Super Hornet operations. The morning weather was cooperative, clear skies and moderate winds that allowed for routine training flights. While other visitors marveled at jets being hurled into the sky by steam catapults, Margaret's eyes tracked different details. She watched wind patterns across the deck, the precise timing of crew movements, the communication protocols between different teams. Her focus was systematic, professional. "The coordination you're witnessing represents years of training," Jessica explained, as a Super Hornet thundered off the bow catapult. "Every person on this deck has a specific role, and their safety depends on everyone executing their responsibilities with perfect precision." Margaret nodded approvingly but made a quiet observation that only those nearby could hear. "The deck crew's positioning during that launch sequence shows excellent adaptation to current wind conditions. They're compensating for the slight crosswind by adjusting their safety zones." A teenage boy standing nearby turned to her with curiosity. "How do you know about that, ma'am?" "My dad's a pilot, but even he doesn't notice stuff like that." Margaret's response carried gentle evasion. "You pick up things over the years when you're around aviation long enough. Your father probably notices more than he mentions." But Master Chief Danny Thompson, a 20-year veteran of carrier operations assisting with the tour, had overheard the exchange. His weathered face showed professional interest as he moved closer to observe Margaret more carefully. The way she automatically positioned herself in safe zones during aircraft movements, her unconscious use of hand signals when observing launching aircraft, her complete lack of startlement when jet engines roared to life mere yards away, all suggested training rather than casual observation. As they continued to the island superstructure, Margaret's commentary became increasingly sophisticated. She made casual observations about radar capabilities, noted modifications to communication equipment, and asked technical questions that demonstrated understanding well beyond what military spouses typically acquired. "Ma'am, you seem remarkably knowledgeable about naval aviation for a dependent spouse," commented Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes, the ship's operations officer. "Did you perhaps work in a related field before retirement?" Margaret's smile carried just enough mystery to deflect further inquiry. "I spent a lot of time around military aviation over the years. You develop an appreciation for the technical aspects when it's been such a significant part of your life." The carefully neutral response satisfied casual curiosity while revealing nothing substantial. But Master Chief Thompson continued studying her with growing recognition, certain that something about her mannerisms seemed familiar in ways he couldn't quite place. During lunch in the ship's mess facilities, Margaret sat near windows overlooking the flight deck, watching aircraft operations while engaging in polite conversation. Her observations about pilot technique and aircraft performance continued displaying sophisticated understanding. "That pilot's approach angle looks a bit steep for current wind conditions," she mentioned while watching a Super Hornet prepare for landing. "The LSO should probably wave him off if he doesn't adjust his glide path." In the next few seconds, almost before the words left her mouth, the landing signal officer on deck made exactly that call, waving off the approaching aircraft for a second attempt. "That's quite a call, ma'am," said Chief Petty Officer Carlos Martinez with genuine admiration. "Most people can't read approach angles that accurately without significant training." "Lucky guess, Chief," Margaret replied modestly. "Though when you've watched enough landings, patterns become apparent." But Chief Martinez wasn't convinced it had been luck. The precision of her observation and confidence with which she'd made the prediction suggested experience rather than chance. As afternoon weather reports began indicating significant changes approaching the Enterprise's position, Margaret observed the briefings with professional interest that went beyond tourist curiosity. Her questions about wind patterns, sea state, predictions, and aircraft recovery procedures demonstrated knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her apparent status as a civilian dependent. The first warning signs of what was coming appeared on the horizon, dark clouds building with ominous speed. Margaret's demeanor shifted subtly as she watched the approaching weather system, her tourist facade beginning to crack around the edges. Something extraordinary was about to happen aboard the USS Enterprise, and the elderly woman who'd been politely dismissed all day was about to prove that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. The weather briefing in the ship's meteorology center should have been routine, but Margaret Williams found herself increasingly concerned as she listened to the updated forecasts. Typhoon Helena was intensifying faster than predicted, and the 6 FA-18 Super Hornets currently airborne on a training mission were going to face challenging conditions for their planned recovery. "Ma'am, these briefings are really intended for operational personnel," said Lieutenant Kevin Richardson, the ship's assistant meteorological officer, with barely concealed irritation. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the family recreation area until the weather passes." Margaret had asked several technical questions about wind shear patterns and deck motion predictions, questions that demonstrated understanding far beyond what the young officer expected from a dependent spouse. Her inquiries made him uncomfortable, particularly when she corrected his analysis of crosswind factors affecting carrier operations. "I understand your concern, Lieutenant," Margaret replied calmly, "but I'm curious about how modern weather prediction compares to earlier methods. The technology has advanced considerably. Ma'am, with respect, weather prediction is a highly technical field that requires years of specialized training," Lieutenant Richardson said, his tone growing more dismissive. "These systems are quite complex, and I'm not sure casual observation would be particularly helpful." Several crew members in the briefing room exchanged glances. The lieutenant's condescension was becoming obvious and uncomfortable. Margaret maintained her composure, but Master Chief Thompson noticed a slight tightening around her eyes, the look of someone accustomed to being taken seriously who was being deliberately diminished. "Of course, Lieutenant," Margaret said quietly. "I defer to your expertise." But as the briefing continued, Margaret's predictions about storm development proved consistently more accurate than the lieutenant's assessments. When she quietly mentioned that the typhoon would likely arrive 2 hours earlier than officially predicted, several experienced petty officers began paying closer attention to her observations rather than the officer's presentation. The situation worsened during the afternoon tour of the Combat Information Center. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was conducting a detailed briefing about the ship's tactical systems when Margaret asked a sophisticated question about radar integration protocols. "Mrs. Williams," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said with strained patience, "these systems are classified and quite complex. I think the technical details might be beyond—" She paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Perhaps we should focus on more general information that would be of interest to family members." The dismissal was clear, and it stung. Margaret had been asking about unclassified aspects of systems she'd helped develop decades earlier, but the implication was that she lacked the intellectual capacity to understand basic concepts. "I apologize if my questions seem inappropriate," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. "I was simply curious about technological improvements. Since my husband's era." "No need to apologize," Lieutenant Commander Hayes replied with artificial sweetness. "It's natural for family members to be curious. Perhaps you'd enjoy our gift shop. They have some lovely items that commemorate the Enterprise's service history." The suggestion that she should go shopping like a typical tourist wife was the final insult. Margaret nodded politely and moved to the back of the group, but Chief Martinez noticed her hands trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. As weather conditions began deteriorating throughout the afternoon, Margaret's attempts to share relevant observations were met with increasingly dismissive responses. When she mentioned specific concerns about aircraft recovery procedures in the developing storm conditions, aviation electronics technician first class David Park actually laughed. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest, but carrier aviation is rocket science," he said with condescending amusement. "These procedures are developed by teams of engineers and test pilots with decades of experience. I'm sure your husband shared some interesting stories, but modern operations are quite different from the old days." Margaret's face flushed, but she maintained her dignity. "You're absolutely right, Petty Officer. I'm sure you know best." But Master Chief Thompson was growing increasingly uncomfortable with how the elderly woman was being treated. Her questions consistently demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond casual interest, and her predictions about weather and operational factors kept proving accurate. Something wasn't adding up. The breaking point came as the ship's crew began preparations for the approaching typhoon. Margaret approached the flight deck supervisor, Senior Chief Patricia Rodriguez, with specific concerns about the recovery procedures being planned for the airborne aircraft. "Senior Chief, I've been observing the weather patterns and deck motion calculations," Margaret said respectfully. "In conditions like these, the standard approach timing might need modification to account for the increased pitch cycles." Senior Chief Rodriguez looked at her with barely concealed exasperation. "Ma'am, I've been running flight deck operations for 15 years. I think I understand carrier aviation procedures better than—" She stopped herself before saying something truly inappropriate, but the implication was clear. "I'm sure you do," Margaret replied quietly. "I was just concerned about the safety of those pilots." "The safety of those pilots is my responsibility," Senior Chief Rodriguez said firmly. "And right now, the best thing you can do for their safety is stay out of the way and let professionals handle professional matters." The dismissal was harsh and public. Several crew members witnessed the exchange, and Margaret's humiliation was complete. She retreated to an observation area, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking around the edges. Chief Martinez found her there 20 minutes later, standing alone and watching the increasingly violent weather through reinforced windows. Her portfolio was open, and she was making detailed calculations with mathematical precision that suggested formal training. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently. Margaret looked up with eyes that held decades of suppressed frustration. "Chief, may I ask you something? In your experience, do credentials matter more than knowledge?" The question caught him off guard. "Ma'am? If someone knew how to save lives but lacked the proper paperwork or recognition, would that knowledge be valuable? Or would it be dismissed because it came from an unexpected source?" Chief Martinez studied her carefully. "Ma'am, knowledge is knowledge. Good ideas can come from anywhere, and smart leaders listen to good ideas regardless of where they originate." Margaret nodded slowly. "I hope you're right, Chief, because I have a feeling that philosophy is about to be tested." As if summoned by her words, the ship's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. "All hands, this is the captain. Weather conditions are deteriorating more rapidly than predicted. Typhoon Helena has intensified to Category 4 status and is approaching our position faster than anticipated. All personnel should prepare for heavy seas and secure all loose gear immediately." Margaret straightened, her tourist facade beginning to fall away completely. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule. The airborne aircraft were running out of fuel, and the crew who had dismissed her all day were about to face conditions that would test every assumption they held about what was possible. In the next few hours, the USS Enterprise would discover exactly who Margaret Williams really was and why her presence aboard their ship represented far more than a routine family visit. the first indication that Typhoon Helena would arrive. With unprecedented fury came when the USS Enterprise began pitching through angles that tested even experienced sailors' sea legs. Margaret Williams moved with sudden purpose toward the flight deck observation area, her weathered hands gripping the rail with familiarity that spoke of countless storms weathered from exactly this position. "Ma'am, you really need to get below." "Deck!" Lieutenant Martinez called out, struggling to maintain her balance as the massive carrier rolled through a particularly violent motion. "These conditions are becoming dangerous for non-essential personnel." Margaret's response carried an authority that seemed to emerge from deep within her past. "Lieutenant, I've been through worse storms than this one. Those pilots are going to need every bit of help we can give them, and right now I might be the only person aboard who knows how to get them down safely." The claim was so extraordinary that it momentarily silenced the young officer. But before Lieutenant Martinez could formulate a response, Commander Tyler Brooks's voice cut through the radio static with barely controlled panic. "Enterprise, this is Phoenix Lead. We've got zero visibility up here. I can't see the deck, can't see the horizon, can't see anything. Fuel state critical across the flight." Margaret stepped closer to the flight operations area, her movements sure and confident, despite the ship's violent motion. She pulled out her notebook, now filled with precise calculations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Typhoon, dynamics and carrier operations in extreme weather. "The deck pitch cycle has shifted to 22 seconds due to the storm's wave pattern," she announced to the flight deck crew within earshot. "The pilots need to begin their approach on the ship's upward motion, not at the stable point. In these conditions, timing everything to the upward pitch gives them the best chance of a successful trap." Master Chief Thompson, who had been watching her with growing amazement, stepped closer. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that goes against standard carrier recovery procedures. We always time approaches to the most stable deck position." Margaret turned to meet his gaze, and for the first time, her carefully maintained facade of being just another military widow began to crack. "Master Chief, standard procedures don't account for Category 4 Typhoons. I'm telling you this because I've done it before, and those boys are going to die if someone doesn't help them understand what they're really facing up there." The absolute certainty in her voice was impossible to dismiss, particularly when her predictions about deck motion continued proving accurate to the second. But the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Senior Chief Rodriguez, the same woman who had dismissed Margaret's concerns hours earlier, now found herself facing the impossible task of recovering 6 aircraft in conditions that pushed every system to its limits. The standard approach procedures she'd confidently defended were proving inadequate against the Typhoon's fury. "Phoenix Lead, you're cleared for approach," she radioed, but her voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there during the afternoon's dismissive conversation with Margaret. "Enterprise, I can't see anything down there," Commander Brooks replied, his professionalism barely containing desperation. "I'm going to need constant talk-down guidance. This isn't like anything we've trained for." Margaret watched the proceedings with growing concern. The flight deck crew was following procedures designed for challenging conditions, not the impossible circumstances developing around them. She stepped forward again, her authority now unmistakable. "Senior Chief, with respect, the approach guidance you're giving them won't work in these conditions. The deck motion patterns are completely different from normal storm recovery procedures." Senior Chief Rodriguez turned to face her, and this time there was no condescension in her expression, only the desperate recognition of someone whose expertise was proving insufficient. "Ma'am, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that I talk those pilots through a recovery technique that was developed specifically for Typhoon conditions. It's not in your current manuals, but it works." Before Senior Chief Rodriguez could respond, Captain Marcus Sterling burst onto the flight deck, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding a nuclear aircraft carrier in conditions that pushed every system to its limits. "Master Chief, I need a status report on our airborne aircraft. Weather conditions are deteriorating faster than any model predicted, and we're looking at recovery operations in the worst storm this ship has faced in 20 years. Sir, Phoenix Flight reports critical fuel state and zero visibility, Master." Chief Thompson replied, "They need to get aboard in the next 15 minutes, or we'll be looking at water landings and search and rescue operations in Typhoon conditions." Captain Sterling's expression grew grimmer as he processed the implications. Search and rescue in a Category 4 Typhoon was essentially a death sentence for downed pilots, even with the most advanced equipment and training. Margaret had been listening to this exchange while continuing her calculations. Now she stepped forward with the kind of confidence that commanded attention even in crisis situations. "Captain, I may be able to help your pilots get aboard safely. The approach they're attempting won't work in these conditions, but there's a modified technique that can compensate for the deck motion and visibility problems they're experiencing." Captain Sterling looked at her with a mixture of desperation and skepticism. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but carrier aviation in Typhoon conditions requires expertise that takes decades to develop. I can't risk my pilots' lives on advice from civilian observers, no matter how well-intentioned." "Sir, I understand your position," Margaret replied with calm determination. "But what I'm suggesting isn't civilian advice. It's based on experience. With exactly these conditions, and it may be the only way to get your people home alive." The radio crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions from the airborne aircraft. Commander Brooks's voice carried growing concern as he reported conditions that were pushing both aircraft and pilots toward their operational limits. "Enterprise Phoenix lead, we need to get on deck soon. Fuel state becoming critical, and weather. Conditions are beyond normal recovery parameters. Request immediate approach clearance." Margaret stood straighter, her eyes scanning the flight deck with the intensity of someone evaluating options and calculating possibilities. The elderly tourist had completely disappeared, replaced by someone whose bearing suggested command experience and crisis management capabilities. "Captain," she said quietly, "those pilots are running out of time and options. Standard procedures are failing because these aren't standard conditions. I know how to get them down safely, but I need you to trust me." The Typhoon was reaching its full fury, the aircraft were running out of fuel, and conventional recovery procedures were proving inadequate. In the next few minutes, Captain Sterling would have to make a decision that would determine whether 6 pilots lived or died, and whether he would trust the knowledge of an elderly woman whose true credentials remained hidden behind decades of careful anonymity. The breaking point had arrived, and Margaret Williams was about to reveal exactly who she was and why her presence aboard the USS Enterprise represented far more than anyone had imagined. The moment of truth arrived when Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached Captain Sterling with a folder marked with security classifications that immediately captured everyone's attention. Despite the storm raging around them, she had managed to obtain information that would change everything about how the crew viewed their mysterious visitor. "Captain, I've received some interesting information about Mrs. Williams," she said, glancing uncertainly between the folder and Margaret. "Pentagon personnel records show some unusual entries under her name. They're requesting a secure communication link to discuss her background directly with you." Captain Sterling accepted the folder with growing curiosity, but his expression transformed to shock as he read the brief summary contained within. His eyes moved from the documents to Margaret and back again, processing information that seemed impossible given what he thought he knew about the elderly woman standing before him. "Mrs. Williams," he said slowly, "according to these records, your full name is Commander Margaret Williams, retired. Is that accurate?" Margaret straightened unconsciously, and for the first time since boarding the Enterprise, her military bearing became unmistakable. "Yes, sir, though it's been many years since anyone used that rank with me." The admission sent ripples of shock through the assembled crew members. Lieutenant Martinez stared in disbelief, while Master Chief Thompson's expression showed recognition, finally clicking into place. The woman he had thought looked familiar was indeed someone whose face belonged in the historical archives of naval aviation. Captain Sterling continued reading from the classified summary, his voice carrying growing amazement. "Commander Williams, these records indicate you were a test pilot and carrier aviation pioneer. You're credited with developing storm recovery procedures and—" He paused, looking up at her with newfound respect. "You hold the record for successful carrier landings in extreme weather conditions." Margaret nodded quietly. "Different era, Captain. Different aircraft, different procedures. But storm flying is storm flying, and some principles don't change regardless of the technology." Senior Chief Rodriguez, who had dismissed Margaret's concerns hours earlier, now stared at her with a mixture of embarrassment and awe. The woman she had condescendingly told to stay out of the way was revealed to be one of the pioneers who had literally written the book on carrier aviation safety procedures. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," Senior Chief Rodriguez said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I didn't know?" "You couldn't have known," Margaret replied graciously, "and you were doing your job, protecting your people. That's what good leaders do." But before the conversation could continue, Commander Brooks' voice erupted from the FAM radio with desperate urgency. "Enterprise, we've got multiple aircraft declaring fuel emergencies. I've lost visual contact with 2 of my wingmen in these clouds. We need immediate recovery guidance, or we're going to start losing aircraft." The crisis had reached its breaking point. 6 highly trained pilots flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world were trapped above a Typhoon-lashed aircraft carrier, running out of fuel and options. Standard procedures were failing, conventional wisdom was proving inadequate, and time was running out for everyone involved. Margaret stepped forward with the authority of someone whose credentials were no longer in question. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to talk those pilots through a recovery technique I developed during Typhoon operations in the South China Sea. It's not in your current manuals because it was classified for 40 years, but it works." Captain Sterling looked at her for a long moment, weighing the impossible circumstances against the extraordinary claims being made by the woman whose true background was only now becoming clear. The decision he made in the next few seconds would determine whether 6 pilots lived or died. "Commander Williams," he said formally, "the radio is yours." Margaret moved to the communications station with movements that betrayed decades of experience. In similar situations, her hands found the controls with practiced familiarity, and when she keyed the microphone, her voice carried the kind of unshakable confidence that pilots learn to trust implicitly during emergencies. "Phoenix Lead, this is Commander Williams aboard Enterprise. I'm going to talk you through a modified approach that will get you and your flight safely aboard. Are you ready to copy instructions?" Commander Brooks' response crackled back immediately. "Commander, I'll take guidance from anyone who can help us get down alive. What do you need us to do?" The crew members who had dismissed Margaret throughout the day now watched in stunned silence as she began issuing a series of precise instructions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of both aircraft systems and the carrier environment. Her guidance incorporated variables that standard procedures didn't account for: deck motion timing in extreme weather, visibility compensation techniques, and fuel management strategies that maximized each aircraft's chances of successful recovery. "Phoenix Lead, you need to begin your approach when the ship starts its upward pitch motion, not at the stable point. In these conditions, the deck will actually be more predictable during the pitch cycle than at the moment of apparent stability. Trust your instruments completely, ignore what your eyes are telling you, and fly the ball exactly as I call it." Lieutenant Richardson, who had condescendingly dismissed her weather predictions hours earlier, now stood transfixed as Margaret's storm analysis proved not only accurate, but essential to the recovery operation. The Typhoon had arrived exactly when she had predicted, with the intensity and characteristics she had described. Master Chief Thompson approached her position with profound respect. "Commander, I remember now where I've seen your photograph. You're in the Naval Aviation Museum. You were part of the group that established carrier suitability standards for women pilots." "Among other things, Master Chief," Margaret replied while continuing to monitor the aircraft approaches. "We did whatever was necessary to prove that. Good piloting transcends any other consideration. The Navy gave us opportunities and we tried to make the most of them." As the first FA-18 began its approach through conditions that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances, Margaret's voice remained calm and authoritative. She guided Commander Brooks through each phase of the recovery, calling adjustments that compensated for factors no standard procedure could address. "Power back. You're high and fast. Trust the deck motion I'm calling. Now ease forward, catch the ball, hold what you've got." Her instructions flowed with the rhythm of someone who had done this countless times before. When the Super Hornet slammed onto the deck and caught the 3-wire in a perfect arrested landing, the flight deck erupted in amazed cheers. "Phoenix 2, you're cleared for approach. Same technique, trust the timing, and remember that the deck will feel different from what you expect when you touch down." One by one, Margaret guided each aircraft through the seemingly impossible recovery. Her instructions adapted to each pilot's individual style and the changing conditions as the Typhoon continued intensifying around them. By the time the 6th Super Hornet trapped aboard, she had successfully recovered an entire flight in conditions that would have resulted in multiple losses under standard procedures. The revelation of Margaret Williams' true identity had transformed her from dismissed tourist to respected authority, but the full scope of her contributions to naval aviation was only beginning to emerge. As word of the dramatic recovery spread throughout the Enterprise, personnel began recognizing that they were in the presence of a genuine legend whose innovations had shaped their entire profession. Word of the miraculous aircraft recovery spread through the USS Enterprise like wildfire, but Margaret Williams wasn't content to rest on the success of saving 6 pilots. She had endured a day of dismissive treatment and condescending attitudes from crew members who should have known better. Now, with her credentials established and her expertise proven, she was going to ensure that the lessons learned went far beyond a single emergency. Captain Sterling approached her as the flight deck crew secured the recovered aircraft. "Commander Williams, what you just accomplished will go down in naval aviation history. Those pilots owe their lives to knowledge and skill that I didn't even know existed." "They did the flying, Captain," Margaret replied with characteristic modesty. "I just reminded them of techniques that were developed through necessity during a different era. Good pilots can adapt to any situation when they understand what they're really facing." But Margaret's mind was already moving beyond the immediate crisis. She had noticed systemic issues in the crew's training and procedures that needed addressing. The dismissive attitudes she had encountered weren't just personal slights. They represented dangerous gaps in institutional knowledge that could cost lives in future emergencies. "Captain, if I may make a suggestion," she said carefully, "this situation has revealed some concerning issues with your crew's preparedness for extreme weather operations. I'd like to propose conducting a comprehensive review of storm recovery procedures and training protocols." Captain Sterling nodded immediately. "Commander, after what just happened, I'm open to any recommendations you might have. What do you need?" "Access to your training records, maintenance logs, and operational procedures. I want to understand how current protocols compare to the techniques that were available during my era. Some of the old methods might be worth incorporating into modern training." Margaret's request was granted immediately, and she began a systematic evaluation of the Enterprise's operational procedures. What she discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The technology had advanced dramatically, but some of the hard-won lessons from earlier generations of naval aviators had been lost in the transition to newer systems. Lieutenant Richardson, who had dismissed her weather predictions, now found himself assigned to assist with her review. His attitude had changed dramatically since witnessing her accurate forecasts and successful aircraft recovery, but Margaret wasn't going to let him off easily. "Lieutenant, I want to review your weather prediction protocols," she said with quiet authority. "Specifically, I'm interested in how you account for rapid storm intensification in carrier operations." "Yes, ma'am," Richardson replied, his earlier condescension replaced by nervous respect. "Our current models use satellite data and computer forecasting to predict storm movement and intensity." "And how often do those predictions prove inadequate for operational planning?" Margaret asked, already knowing the answer from her observations. Richardson's discomfort was obvious. "Well, ma'am, the models are generally accurate, but sometimes conditions develop faster than predicted." "Lieutenant, sometimes isn't acceptable when pilots' lives are at stake. The storm prediction methods I use today were developed 50 years ago, but they proved more accurate than your computer models because they account for variables that haven't been programmed into modern systems." Margaret's critique was professional, but pointed. She wasn't interested in humiliating the young officer, but she was determined to ensure that overconfidence in technology didn't replace the fundamental skills that could save lives when systems failed. Senior Chief Rodriguez, who had earlier told Margaret to stay out of the way of professionals, now approached with genuine humility. "Commander, I want to apologize for my behavior today. I was wrong to dismiss your concerns, and I'm grateful that you were willing to help despite how you were treated." "Senior Chief, you were protecting your people and following established procedures," Margaret replied. "That's what good leaders do, but I want to work with you to ensure that you're People have access to all the tools they might need in future emergencies. The collaboration that followed was remarkable. Margaret began conducting informal training sessions with flight deck crews, sharing techniques that had been developed during an era when carrier aviation was even more dangerous than it was today. Her methods were practical, tested under fire, and designed to compensate for the kinds of equipment failures and extreme conditions that could overwhelm even the most advanced systems. Master Chief Thompson became her primary ally in implementing changes to training protocols. His respect for her expertise was genuine, and his influence with the crew helped overcome resistance to modifying established procedures. Commander, some of the younger personnel are having trouble accepting that old techniques might be superior to current methods, he reported during one of their planning sessions. They've been trained to rely on technology and manual calculation. Methods seem primitive to them. Master Chief, technology is a tool, not a replacement for fundamental skills, Margaret replied. When that technology fails, and it will fail, people need to understand the underlying principles well enough to adapt. That's what we're really teaching here. Margaret's approach was systematic and comprehensive. She wasn't just sharing individual techniques. She was rebuilding institutional knowledge that had been gradually lost as older generations of naval aviators retired and took their experience with them. But her efforts extended beyond technical training. She was also addressing the cultural issues that had led to her dismissive treatment earlier in the day. During crew meetings, she spoke about the importance of listening to all sources of knowledge, regardless of their apparent authority or credentials. Good ideas can come from anywhere, she told a group of junior officers. Your responsibility as leaders is to evaluate information based on its merit, not its source. If you dismiss knowledge because it comes from an unexpected direction, you might be throwing away something that could save lives. The message was clear and the timing was perfect. The crew had just witnessed the consequences of dismissing her expertise, and they were receptive to learning from the experience. Margaret's systematic approach to sharing knowledge and improving procedures was having a broader impact than just technical training. She was rebuilding confidence in the value of experience and institutional memory while demonstrating that innovation often came from combining old wisdom with new capabilities. As the Typhoon began to subside and normal operations resumed, the USS Enterprise was becoming a different ship. The crew's respect for Margaret was universal, but more importantly, they were beginning to understand that expertise came in many forms and that their assumptions about knowledge and authority needed constant examination. The fight back had begun not with confrontation or revenge, but with patient, systematic improvement of the systems and attitudes that had led to the initial dismissal of her expertise. Margaret Williams was proving that the most effective way to combat ignorance and prejudice was through education and demonstrated competence. Admiral Rebecca Washington's helicopter appeared on the horizon despite the continuing rough weather, the VH-60 Whitehawk approaching the Enterprise through conditions that tested even experienced naval aviators. Margaret Williams watched the approaching aircraft with growing anticipation. She knew this visit would complete the revelation of exactly who she was and why her presence aboard the Enterprise represented such an extraordinary occurrence. The Admiral's helicopter managed a textbook landing on the storm-tossed flight deck, and Admiral Washington emerged with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But her approach toward Margaret carried unmistakable deference and respect that surprised everyone witnessing the exchange. When she was 20 feet away, Admiral Washington stopped and came to rigid attention. "Commander Margaret Williams, permission to come aboard and pay my respects, ma'am." Margaret returned to attention with military precision that seemed to span the decades since her active service. "Permission granted, Admiral, though the formalities really aren't necessary after all these years." "With respect, ma'am, the formalities are absolutely necessary," Admiral Washington replied, her voice carrying emotion that surprised everyone present. "You taught me how to fly, how to lead, and how to never accept limitations that others tried to impose. Everything I've achieved in my career builds on foundations you established." The crew members who had dismissed Margaret throughout the day now stood in stunned silence as Admiral Washington turned to address them directly. Her voice carried across the flight deck despite the continuing wind and rain. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of Commander Margaret Williams, one of the most significant figures in naval aviation history. She was among the first women to achieve carrier qualification, developed storm flying techniques that saved hundreds of lives, and proved that excellence in aviation knows no boundaries. Lieutenant Richardson, who had condescendingly dismissed her weather predictions hours earlier, now found himself face-to-face with the woman whose innovations had literally shaped the meteorological procedures he used daily. His earlier arrogance was replaced by mortification as he realized the scope of his era. Senior Chief Rodriguez, who had told Margaret to stay out of the way of professionals, now understood that she had been dismissing advice from one of the people who had written the professional standards she claimed to uphold. The irony was devastating. "Commander Williams," Admiral Washington continued, "would you do us the honor of addressing the ship's company? Your presence here represents a living connection to our finest traditions, and these sailors deserve to hear directly from someone who helped shape the Navy they serve." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces that now showed respect and admiration replacing the earlier confusion and dismissal. For decades, her contributions had remained quietly acknowledged within professional circles, but largely unknown to the broader military community. "Admiral, I'm honored by your request, but I'm not sure what wisdom an old pilot might offer to sailors who are already demonstrating excellence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from those who faced challenges when the stakes were highest and the support systems were minimal," Admiral Washington replied. "Your story deserves to be told, and these young people deserve to hear it from you directly." But Margaret had a different agenda. She wasn't interested in delivering inspirational speeches. She was focused on ensuring that the systematic failures in training and attitude that had led to her dismissive treatment would never endanger lives again. "Admiral, before I address the crew, I'd like to discuss some serious deficiencies I've observed in current training protocols and institutional knowledge retention. The issues that led to today's emergency weren't just weather-related. They were systemic." Admiral Washington's expression grew serious as Margaret outlined her findings. The loss of institutional knowledge, the over-reliance on technology without understanding underlying principles, and most critically, the cultural tendency to dismiss expertise that didn't come with obvious credentials. "Commander, what you're describing sounds like a fleet-wide issue," Admiral Washington said after reviewing Margaret's documentation. "If these problems exist here on one of our most prestigious vessels, they likely exist throughout the Navy." "That's exactly what I'm concerned about," Margaret replied. "Today's success was fortunate, but the next emergency might not have someone available who remembers the old techniques. We need to institutionalize this knowledge before it's completely lost." Margaret's systematic documentation of the Enterprise's procedural gaps was devastating. She had identified specific instances where current training failed to account for extreme conditions, where technology dependence had replaced fundamental skills, and where cultural attitudes prevented effective knowledge transfer between generations. Lieutenant Richardson found himself called to account for his weather prediction failures. Margaret's analysis demonstrated that his dismissal of non-computerized forecasting methods had directly contributed to the crew's unpreparedness for the Typhoon's rapid intensification. "Lieutenant, your confidence in computer models led you to ignore observable indicators that would have provided earlier warning of the storm's intensity," Margaret explained during a formal review session. "This isn't about replacing technology, it's about understanding when technology isn't sufficient." Richardson's professional reputation was crumbling as Margaret's critique exposed fundamental gaps in his understanding of meteorological principles. His earlier condescension toward her primitive methods now appeared as dangerous ignorance rather than professional confidence. Senior Chief Rodriguez faced even more serious consequences. Margaret's documentation showed that her dismissive attitude toward civilian input had created a dangerous environment where valuable information was routinely ignored based on the source rather than the content. "Senior Chief, your responsibility is to ensure flight deck safety using all available information," Captain Sterling said during the review. "When you dismissed Commander Williams's expertise based on her apparent civilian status, you created unnecessary risk for your personnel." The systematic dismantling of the attitudes and procedures that had led to Margaret's mistreatment was thorough and professional. She wasn't seeking personal revenge. She was ensuring that future emergencies wouldn't be complicated by the same institutional failures. Margaret's recommendations were being implemented immediately, new training protocols that incorporated both historical techniques and modern technology, cultural sensitivity training that emphasized evaluating information based on merit rather than source, and most importantly, formal procedures for capturing and preserving institutional knowledge from retiring personnel. But the most devastating consequence for those who had dismissed her wasn't professional. It was personal. They had to live with the knowledge that their arrogance and prejudice had nearly cost 6 pilots their lives, and that they had treated a genuine hero with casual disrespect. As word of Margaret's true identity and the day's events spread throughout the fleet, the careers of several Enterprise personnel were effectively over. Their names would be forever associated with the failure to recognize expertise when it mattered most. The downfall wasn't dramatic or confrontational, it was systematic, thorough, and absolutely devastating to those who had allowed prejudice to override professional judgment. 3 days after the Typhoon, Captain Sterling convened a formal review. Board in the Enterprise's main conference room. The mahogany table was surrounded by senior officers, and at the head sat Margaret Williams, no longer the dismissed tourist, but the expert witness whose testimony would determine the professional futures of several crew members. Admiral Washington presided over the proceedings, her expression grave as she reviewed the extensive documentation Margaret had compiled. The evidence was overwhelming. Systematic failures in training, dangerous gaps in institutional knowledge, and most damning of all, a culture that valued appearances over expertise. This review will examine the events of June 10th and the systemic issues that contributed to the near loss of 6 naval aviators, Admiral Washington announced. Commander Williams, please present your findings. Margaret stood with quiet dignity, her leather portfolio now revealed to contain decades of annotated procedures, training modifications, and safety innovations that had saved countless lives. Throughout her career, the faded patches on its cover were now identifiable as commendations for valor, distinguished service, and pioneering achievements in naval aviation. Admiral, the events of June 10th represent a catastrophic failure of institutional knowledge retention and professional evaluation protocols. Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years perfecting these systems. 6 highly trained pilots nearly died not because of equipment failure or weather conditions, but because this crew had lost access to proven techniques for handling extreme situations. Lieutenant Richardson sat at the far end of the table, his earlier arrogance replaced by pale-faced recognition of his career's destruction. Margaret's weather prediction analysis had revealed that his dismissal of non-computerized forecasting methods had left the ship dangerously unprepared for the Typhoon's rapid intensification. Lieutenant Richardson's failure to incorporate historical weather analysis techniques into his forecasting directly contributed to the crew's surprise at the storm's intensity, Margaret continued, consulting her meticulously organized notes. His condescending dismissal of proven methodologies demonstrated a dangerous overconfidence in technology without understanding its limitations. The lieutenant's commanding officer made notes that everyone knew would end Richardson's career progression. His refusal to listen to Margaret's accurate predictions had been professionally inexcusable. Senior Chief Rodriguez faced even more serious consequences. Margaret's documentation showed that her authority-based dismissal of civilian input had created a systemic safety hazard that extended far beyond the Typhoon emergency. Senior Chief Rodriguez's statement that professionals should handle professional matters while dismissing my safety concerns represents a fundamental misunderstanding of her responsibilities, Margaret explained. Flight deck safety requires evaluating all available information based on its merit, not its source. Her attitude endangered personnel and violated basic leadership principles. Rodriguez stared at the table, knowing that her 20-year career was effectively over. The woman she had told to stay out of the way was now documenting her failures for a review board that would determine her professional future. But Margaret's most devastating testimony concerned the systemic cultural issues that had enabled individual failures to compound into a life-threatening crisis. The institutional arrogance displayed by multiple crew members represents a dangerous departure from naval aviation's fundamental principles, she stated with quiet authority. Excellence in this profession has always depended on learning from all available sources and continuously improving our capabilities. When that stops, people die. Captain Sterling listened with growing unease as Margaret's analysis revealed that the problems extended far beyond individual personnel issues. The Enterprise's training protocols, evaluation procedures, and knowledge retention systems had all contributed to creating an environment where vital expertise could be casually dismissed. Commander Williams, what would you recommend to prevent similar incidents in the future? Admiral Washington asked. Margaret's response was comprehensive and devastating to the current command structure. Complete revision of training protocols to incorporate historical techniques alongside modern technology, mandatory cultural competency training for all personnel in leadership positions, and formal procedures for capturing and preserving institutional knowledge from experienced personnel regardless of their apparent status or credentials. The recommendations amounted to an admission that the Enterprise's current operations were fundamentally flawed. Several senior officers would face career consequences for allowing these deficiencies to develop under their command. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, who had suggested Margaret visit the gift shop rather than participate in technical discussions, now faced professional review for her failure to recognize expertise when it was presented. Her condescending attitude toward family members had created dangerous blind spots in the ship's operational awareness. The dismissive treatment of Mrs. Williams, Commander Williams, by multiple personnel represents a systemic failure in professional evaluation and leadership judgment, Admiral Washington summarized after reviewing all testimony. These failures nearly resulted in the loss of 6 aircraft and pilots, and they indicate serious deficiencies in this vessel's operational culture. Margaret's final statement to the review board was both gracious and devastating. I don't seek punishment for individuals who were following what they believe to be proper procedures, but I do insist that the Navy learn from these failures and ensure that expertise is recognized and utilized regardless of its source. The lives of future aviators depend on our ability to overcome institutional arrogance and embrace knowledge, wherever it originates. The review board's recommendations were swift and comprehensive. Lieutenant Richardson would be transferred to shore duty with a fitness report that would end his advancement opportunities. Senior Chief Rodriguez faced reduction in rank and mandatory retraining before being assigned to a non-supervisory position. Lieutenant Commander Hayes would receive formal reprimand and additional leadership training, but the most significant outcome was the fleet-wide implementation of Margaret's recommended changes. Her techniques would be incorporated into training. Curricula, her knowledge retention protocols would become standard procedure, and her cultural competency requirements would be mandatory for all leadership positions. The climax wasn't a dramatic confrontation, it was the quiet, systematic destruction of careers built on arrogance and the institutional recognition that excellence required humility and openness to learning from unexpected sources. 6 months. After the Typhoon, Margaret Williams stood once again on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, but this time her presence was official and celebrated. She wore her old dress blue uniform, the ribbons and decorations telling the story of a career that had shaped naval aviation for decades. Today, the Enterprise was hosting the graduation ceremony for the first class of aviators trained under the new protocols she had developed. Admiral Washington stood beside her, watching as young pilots demonstrated the storm recovery techniques that had saved 6 lives during Typhoon Helena. Commander, these procedures are now standard throughout the fleet. Your innovations are being taught at every naval aviation training facility in the Navy. Margaret smiled with quiet satisfaction. Admiral, the most important change isn't the procedures, it's the attitude. These young people are learning to evaluate knowledge based on its merit, not its source. That's what will really save lives in future emergencies. The transformation had been remarkable. Margaret's systematic documentation of the Enterprise's failures had triggered a fleet-wide review that revealed similar problems throughout naval aviation. The cultural arrogance that had led to her dismissive treatment was identified as a systemic safety hazard that required immediate correction. Lieutenant Richardson had been transferred to a shore-based weather station, where his over-reliance on computer models could be corrected through intensive retraining. His career progression had ended, but he was learning to incorporate the historical analysis techniques he had once dismissed. The humbling experience was proving educational, if professionally devastating. Senior Chief Rodriguez had been reduced in rank and assigned to a training facility where she was learning the leadership principles she had violated during the Typhoon emergency. Her new position involved teaching cultural competency to junior personnel, a daily reminder of how her prejudices had endangered lives. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had completed additional leadership training and was now serving as the Navy's liaison for institutional knowledge preservation. Her experience with dismissing Margaret's expertise made her uniquely qualified to identify and prevent similar failures throughout the fleet. But the most significant changes were institutional. Margaret's recommendations had been implemented across naval aviation, creating formal procedures for capturing expertise from retiring personnel, incorporating historical techniques into modern training, and most importantly, evaluating information based on merit rather than source credentials. The new training protocols are showing remarkable results, reported Captain Sterling, who had remained in command of the Enterprise and overseen the implementation of Margaret's reforms. Pilot performance in extreme conditions has improved significantly, and we're identifying valuable knowledge from unexpected sources throughout the fleet. Margaret nodded approvingly. Captain, the goal was never to replace modern technology with old techniques. It was to ensure that people understand the underlying principles well enough to adapt when systems fail or conditions exceed normal parameters. The ceremony concluded, with Admiral Washington presenting Margaret with the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for her contributions to aviation safety and training excellence. But Margaret's greatest satisfaction came from watching the young aviators who would benefit from the institutional changes she had implemented. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you personally," said Lieutenant Jennifer Park, one of the first graduates of the new training program. "The techniques you developed saved my life last month when I had to recover aboard the Lincoln during a storm in the North Atlantic. The computer guidance systems failed, but the manual procedures worked perfectly." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized that her patient fight against institutional arrogance was already saving lives. "Lieutenant, that's exactly why these changes were necessary. Technology is wonderful when it works, but pilots need to understand fundamental principles that will keep them alive when technology fails." As the ceremony ended and personnel began dispersing, Margaret stood quietly on the flight deck where 6 months earlier she had been dismissed as an irrelevant tourist. The transformation was complete, not just in her personal recognition, but in the Navy's understanding of how expertise should be identified, preserved, and utilized. Master Chief Thompson, who had been the first to recognize that Margaret's knowledge went beyond casual observation, approached her with genuine emotion. "Commander, I want you to know that everything you've accomplished here extends far beyond just safety procedures. You've changed how we think about leadership, knowledge, and respect for experience." "Master Chief, the real change is that young people like Lieutenant Park will never have to face the kind of dismissive attitudes that nearly cost 6 pilots their lives. That's worth more than any personal recognition." Margaret's victory wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about ensuring that institutional arrogance would never again prevent life-saving knowledge from being recognized and applied. The crew members who had dismissed her had faced professional consequences, but more importantly, the Navy had learned from their failures and implemented systemic changes that would protect future aviators. As she prepared to leave the Enterprise, for the final time, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey from dismissed tourist to celebrated hero. The lesson wasn't that appearances could be deceiving. It was that excellence could emerge from any source, and that wise leaders remained humble enough to recognize and learn from expertise wherever they encountered it. The Typhoon had passed, the pilots had been saved, and the Navy was stronger for having learned that knowledge and wisdom came in many forms. Margaret Williams had won her fight not through confrontation or revenge, but through patient, systematic improvement of the systems and attitudes that protected the lives of those who served. Standing on the flight deck one last time, watching jets launch into a clear sky using techniques she had perfected decades earlier, Margaret knew that her legacy would live on in every pilot who survived an emergency because they had been taught to value knowledge over credentials and competence over appearance. The old woman who had been laughed off the aircraft carrier had proven that heroism often came in unexpected packages, and that the most important battles were fought not for personal recognition, but for the principles that kept good people alive when everything else failed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.